Hi, I'm Frostelian, and welcome to the Frost Death Knight Guide for Legion 7.0. There are several new things with Frost, and in this video, I'll go through the fundamental mechanics and changes to get you in the game as fast as possible. Let's start with resources. Runes are a shared resource to use abilities. There are 6 in total, and they work like charges. The different flavours of runes are gone. There are now simply generic runes. You can spend all 6, but only 3 can recharge at a time, and as all runes are the same, it doesn't matter which 3. And whilst you want to use them quickly, as long as you keep 3 recharging, it doesn't matter when you use them. Spending a rune generates the second resource Runic Power. Spending Runic Power has a chance to trigger Runic Empowerment, which returns a depleted rune. These two resources work together. Spending one generates the other. Spending Runic Power without any recharging runes wastes Runic Empowerment, so try not to do this. The biggest change in Legion is that the different weapon versions of Frost have been combined in a sense. You can no longer use two-hand weapons, only one hand, but the one-hand gameplay spamming Howling Blast has gone. Instead, it's the two-handed Obliterate spam. And along with these changes, the global cooldown has been increased to 1.5 seconds, reduced by haste. Let's move on to the core abilities. If you ever played two-hand Frost, Legion is basically the same thing. There are 3 main abilities single target. Howling Blast costs a rune, deals radial frost damage around a target, and applies Frost Fever to all targets hit. Frost Fever is a disease dealing frost damage. Every tick has a chance to return 5 runic power, so try to keep it on as many things as possible. Obliterate costs 2 runes, deals physical damage, and is your main rune spender. It has a chance to proc Rhyme, which is a free Howling Blast, dealing additional damage. Frost Strike costs 25 runic power and deals frost damage. This is the main ability consuming runic power, and therefore triggering runic empowerment. The defining mechanic of Frost, Killing Machine, has also been changed. It still gives a guaranteed critical strike, but it no longer affects Frost Strike, only Obliterate. But the biggest change is that it also works off critical hit chance, and can only proc from auto-attack criticals, meaning if you don't have any crit, you don't get any procs. So let's break down the gameplay. In general terms, you use runes on Obliterate to generate runic power, and Rhyme procs to maintain Frost Fever. And Frost Strike consumes that runic power and brings back more runes for Obliterate. But I think that's a little oversimplified, so let's look at the components in slightly more detail. In Legion, the base damage of Howling Blast is very low. You really don't want to be wasting a rune on it unless Frost Fever will drop off, but you should be able to maintain it entirely from Rhyme procs unless you are very unlucky. Runes are returning in sets of 3, but Obliterate costs 2. It's always leaving a rune behind. So the intention is that Frost Strike will gain Runic Empowerment and bring you back a rune to be used with the remaining rune on Obliterate. Every Obliterate has a chance to proc Rhyme, which you don't have to use immediately, but should be used quickly before the next Obliterate, or it risks conflicting with Killing Machine. If you get both Rhyme and Killing Machine together, the best choice will usually be to use Killing Machine, but it will depend on the resources you have available to handle consecutive procs. Killing Machine in Legion is a little strange, because with enough crit, it's basically made redundant, and crit is now the main stat required to proc it. So unlike Bloodsap, Runic Empowerment really wants you to keep rolling for runes as often as you can. Whilst you could basically ignore Killing Machine if you wanted to, the best option is to do as much as you can before using a normal Obliterate. When you're at 2 runes or less, Frost Strike as often as possible, just as long as you won't cap 4 runes, as that would be interrupting the recharging set, meaning you'll often find yourself in a sequence of Obliterate, Rhyme, Frost Strike. Okay, let's move on to AoE. There's a new AoE ability in Legion called Remorseless Winter. It's frost damage radiating from yourself and costs 1 rune with a 20-second cooldown. The bulk of your AoE in the core toolset is passive from Rhyme. The active AoE has been put into Talents, so without it, use the minimum amount of Howling Blasts to apply and maintain Frost Fever across as many things as possible. When preparing for AoE, you want to have Rhyme ready to avoid losing a rune to normal Howling Blast. But there's no set rule for when to start holding a Rhyme proc. Every Obliterate you use can overwrite the Rhyme you're holding, so you'll have to judge for yourself quite how lucky you are feeling with the resources you have available. Okay, so let's go over the other pieces before Talents. Cooldowns. Pillar of Frost is a strong damage buff every 60 seconds. Simply use this when you can. Empower a rune weapon is every 3 minutes, brings back all your runes and generates 25 runic power. Use it in combination with Pillar. Death Knights are the only class with a weapon enchant in Legion. Rune Forging on Frost has 2 options, Rune of the Fallen Crusader and Rune of Razor Ice. Crusader is a simple strength buff. Razor Ice adds damage on every hit with that weapon, and increases the frost damage of some abilities against that target, but things like Howling Blast are not affected. There are only really two options, and with the exception of the talent Shattering Strikes, there is nothing suggesting double Razor Ice is a good idea. So, you'll be using Razor Ice main hand, Crusader offhand. And now on to the more general things. Raise Ally is a combat res. Death Strike costs 45 runic power, and also triggers runic empowerment, but it's very expensive for such a small heal. You never want to pay for this. Dark Succor is a buff after you kill something, making your next Death Strike free and doubling the heal. Death Grip pulls a target within 30 yards to you. This is the signature ability of Death Knights, but mobility has always been a weak point for DKs. Legion, if anything, makes the problem worse. Death's Advance has been removed as a sprint, and is now a passive 15% increased move speed. It's been replaced with Wraithwalk, a channeled sprint increasing movement speed by 70% for 3 seconds, every 1 minute. But doing anything useful during Wraithwalk will stop it. And for defensives, Anti-Magic Shell is on a 1 minute cooldown. It can absorb magic damage, returning runic power, and preventing debuffs from being applied to you. Icebound Fortitude is the standard defensive cooldown, reducing damage taken by 20% and giving immunity to stuns for 8 seconds. And lastly, there is the miscellaneous group. Mind Freeze is the generic interrupt, Chains of Ice is a ranged snare, Death Gate is a portal to Icarus, the class hall, Dark Command is a taunt, Control Undead is a gimmick, Path of Frost is water walking, and On a Pale Horse is increased mount speed. And Frost no longer generates additional runic power per rune spent, because presences have been removed. Okay, as for stats, Multi-Strike has been removed, and the effective secondary stats has been reduced. The main focus will be Strength, and because Killing Machine works off of Crit and Haste, which also gives more actions and brings back runes faster, the main focus will be Crit, then Haste, then Mastery, and lastly Versatility. Right, let's move on to talents. Tier 56. Shattering Strikes makes Frost Strike deal more damage when consuming a full stack of Razor Ice. This is heavily reliant on the speed you can stack Razor Ice and want to both generate and consume it as fast as possible. But this is the talent I was referring to earlier at Runeforging, and whilst double Razor Ice stacks fastest, I am reliably informed it is a significant DPS loss, so you are still left with offhand Crusader. If that changes in the near term, I will add a note. Icy Talons gives Frost Strike an increased auto attack speed and so increases Killing Machine procs. Along with requiring high uptime, it also has a ramp up time, but when combined with Runic Attenuation, that's easy enough to maintain. Murderous Efficiency has a chance to return a rune when you use Killing Machine, which translates into refunding half an Obliterate to be used with a leftover rune. It's also quite user-friendly because it doesn't change the core rotation, but you can on occasion find yourself capping runes. Tier 57. Freezing Fog increases the damage of Howling Blast and Frost Fever. The base damage of Howling Blast is beyond saving, but this increase is multiplied with Rime, so when combined with the extra dot damage, it's a sustained DPS talent. Frozen Pulse is a passive AoE on auto attacks whenever you run out of runes. You therefore want to spend as much time out of runes as possible, and so pooling runic power to dump when you have leftover runes. And even if this was to do great damage, it is a mechanically illogical talent that makes no sense, and I really don't want to recommend it. Horn of Winter gives you 2 runes and 10 runic power on a 30-second cooldown. It's damage on demand, which is always good, but you aren't struggling to find resources most of the time. Tier 58, Ice Cap has Frost Strike, Frost Scythe and Obliterate crits, reducing the remaining cooldown of Pillar of Frost by 1 second. Simply the more pillars you can get, the better. Hungering Rune Weapon replaces Empower Rune Weapon, and delivers those resources over time. 1 rune and 5 runic power instantly, and then every 1.5 seconds for 12 seconds. The main problem with Empower Weapon is that it's very wasteful. This resolves some of the problems, but you're still going to be capping resources. It's only really useful with Breath of Sindragosa. Avalanche adds an AoE onto Pillar of Frost, triggering once per critical action, which makes it effective single target as well as AoE, synergizing with Icy Talons. Tier 60. Abomination's Might gives Obliterate crits a chance to stun mobs and daze players. It has no function in PvE, and probably very little in PvP. Blinding Sleet is an AoE disorientate, with an ever lowering break threshold. Even if it does break instantly, it's an AoE interrupt, and will be the standard raid choice. Winter is Coming has a stun effect when using both Remorseless Winter and Pillar of Frost, obviously working best in situations with regular AoE such as dungeons, where you'll be using both abilities constantly. Tier 75, Volatile Shielding, adds more absorption and a small AoE onto Anti-Magic Shell for the cost of no longer generating runic power. The runic power would have been a Frost Strike, and this replaces it with some variable arcane damage. Permafrost turns some of your auto-attack damage into a stacking Absorb Shield. This gives you effective health to take damage and not worry about it, but it does take a long time to build up, although it's a great talent and will be the standard pick this tier. It also synergizes with Icy Talons. White Walker adds a damage reduction and snare onto Wraithwalk, turning it into a short defensive cooldown, but only consider this an option if you don't have the time to build up a shield with Permafrost. Tier 90. Frost Scythe is an AoE attack that benefits from Killing Machine. It introduces rotational change and on a single target is used in place of Obliterate to consume Killing Machine. So in order to keep obliterating your rotation, Scythe's base damage is very low, but crits are 4 times normal damage. Otherwise, you just spend your time spamming Scythe. Scythe also comes with significant mechanical advantages. You need even less resource management because Killing Machine procs can now be used with the leftover runes from Obliterate. And because it doesn't proc Rhyme, when you get both procs together, you can use Killing Machine without overwriting Rhyme. However, it has the same mechanical disadvantages that the old Frost Strike used to have, because we are back to unintentionally clipping Obliterate instead of Scythe on Killing Machine. Scythe is also the primary source of active AoE damage, and when consuming Killing Machine, it crits across all targets. The AoE rotation is simply spam Scythe, whilst of course maintaining Frostweaver from Howling Blast, which means you really want to have a Rhyme waiting when you transition, so you don't have to lose a rune. And it synergizes well with Murderous Efficiency, because those returned runes can immediately be used on more Scythes. And with Razor Ice on the main hand, Scythe spreads the debuff across all targets, but stacks them slower than Obliterate, which means if you are using Shattering Strikes, you will have to frequently change target to Frost Strike on full stacks. Runic Attenuation generates runic power from auto attacks. There is no change to core abilities, you simply get more Frost Strikes over time. Synergizes with both Shattering Strikes and Icy Talons, but without Scythe there is no active AoE, so this is single target. Gathering Storm makes spending runes increase the damage and duration of Remorseless Winter. It's a more sustained and passive approach to AoE that just maintains the core rotation. With the weapon traits this could be valid, but I'd still be recommending Scythe. Tier 100. Obliteration lasts 8 seconds, makes every Frost Strike trigger Killing Machine, and Obliterate cost 1 rune. Has a 90-second cooldown. This is a very useful DPS cooldown with several points. With a little resource planning, you can alternate between Obliterate and Frost Strike, because using Obliterate still generates 20 runic power. But you don't have to use Obliterate to consume Killing Machines, you could be using Scythe, which means this is also an effective AoE cooldown, but you won't be generating as much runic power as you are using Obliterate, so you need to start with 70 runic power to avoid running out whilst alternating. And if you're still using Shattering Strikes, you will have to change target to eat Razor Ice stacks, unless, for whatever reason, you are using double Razor Ice. Obliteration also synergizes with Ice Cap. When using Pillar of Frost on cooldown, you only need to offset it by 30 seconds for it to line up, and that's very easy to achieve. Breath of Sindragosa is a channeled frontal AoE that drains 13 runic power per second. You can sustain it much longer than in Warlords, with practically no effort. Simply gather your resources, hit Breath, and do the rotation without Frost Strike, and it will last roughly 50 seconds if you keep an eye on it. It synergizes with Horn of Winter and Hungering Rune Weapon, but talents like Icy Talons need Frost Strike, not runic power spent, so don't take them. But that said, at current damage levels, this is not a single target option, meaning you would only be taking Breath for use on multiple targets, which calls into question quite how you want to use your runes, as you'd want to be AoEing with Scythe, but that's generating runic power at a slower rate than Breath is taking it. Depending on how this goes, it could be abandoned for another expansion. Glacial Advance is a line of small frozen spikes dealing AoE damage. It has a 15-second cooldown reduced by haste, and even though there are multiple spikes, the ability only deals damage once per enemy. It's not targeted, so you need to be pointing in the right direction, but there's nothing to manage, you just use it off cooldown. Okay, that's all the talents. As for builds, you'll have to go by the style of damage you need for the thing you're doing. In general terms, you'll be combining synergies, so I can offer a few ideas. Single target would have Runic Attenuation with Shattering Strikes or Murderous Efficiency. AoE would include Scythe, Murderous Efficiency, and Freezing Fog for more Rhyme damage, or Horn of Winter for more Scythes. There are variable options for both builds, combining either Ice Cap and Obliteration as Burst, or Avalanche and Glacial Advance as Sustain. For a general build, I'd be suggesting the Sustain options. And of course, if Breath of Sindragosa got massively buffed, you'd be taking it with Runic Attenuation, Hungering Rune Weapon, Horn of Winter, and Murderous Efficiency. Right, so all that's left is to go through the weapon. Here are the main traits. Frozen Soul is more AoE, Hypothermia is more damage on Frost Fever, the only active is Sindragosa's Fury. It's a 5-minute cooldown that launches a mini Sindragosa in the direction you're facing, AoEing everything. The artifact ability you get for starting Legion is called Crystalline Swords. It's not a main trait, and it's just a passive, so you simply ignore it. And here are the more useful traits. And so you have some extra crit damage, more damage during Pillar, more Mastery, and longer reach on Frost Strike improves quality of life. And here are the rest. The weapon is not a talent system, it's simply extra leveling. You will find different flavoured relics that add a rank to a trait and increase your weapon's item level. The best relic to take is simply the highest item level. Because it takes time to unlock, the route is kind of important, at least initially. There aren't any traits that change your gameplay or mechanics on Frost, so it's simply a case of going around picking up damage. So starting from Blades of Frost, we want to head down towards Cold as Ice, picking up nothing but the boots, Frozen Core and Frozen Skin on the way. Then head into the main trait Hypothermia, choosing Ambidexterity. Go back to the start and take Blast Radius to further increase rhyme damage and Chill of the Grave to help uptime. After this, you only have 2 sides left. It's cheaper to take Sindragosa's Fury before Frozen Soul, but it will be down to tuning at the time. And that's it for the weapon, and also concludes the first Frost Death Knight guide in Legion. If you found it helpful, please like the video as that will help others find it. If you wanted more detailed information, I'll be taking a closer look at different mechanics in the future, as well as other specs and classes. I'm afraid it's not feasible to constantly annotate videos as tuning progresses. If you want to keep up to date with Frost, I recommend a Google document that will be linked in the description. Best of luck in Legion, and thanks for watching.